Welcome, everybody, to Search Institute's webinar, The State of Developmental Assets. We're very excited you're here today. I know there's so much going on. I'm sure you're in the midst of the summer of all the things that are happening. And if you're a teacher, then you probably are catching up on lots of things that needed to be done. And if you have young people around still today, I'm sure it's also keeping you very busy. So thanks for making the time to be with us. We would love to hear where you're coming from. If you would drop in the chat where you're coming from regionally, what city, what state, and then what organization. We'd love to see those start to pop up on the chat so we know who's here with us today. I'm very excited to be here today and to talk about our developmental assets and kind of the state of developmental assets right now. I'm joined with me today with my colleague and someone who I'm very grateful to have on my team and on our team, Dr. Joanna Williams, who is our Senior Director of Research here at Search Institute. I know that you all are going to benefit from her deep dive and understanding of our data and how it applies to our everyday lives with young people. We're going to be talking about developmental assets, but we also want to introduce some of our broader frameworks and the ways that we are thinking towards the future. And we are excited to have you here to also add things to the chat as they come up. But if you have any questions that you want to ask, we have a wonderful team behind the scenes that will be answering those questions. And we'll also be addressing helping you connect to any resources that you might need. So I want to just jump right in because I know this hour will fly by because we also have a wonderful guest, a partner who will be joining us later, who I will introduce as well to talk about some of the ways that they're using the developmental assets framework in practice. Developmental assets is inextricably tied to our history. Although we're older than the 1990s, when developmental assets was first put out in the world in late 1990s, 91, it really was a catalyst for us as a organization to help connect us to our sense of purpose, the purpose that we have in the world, as we were a part of a movement that was much bigger than us, but we were pioneers in the movement of positive youth development. This idea that young people have something to offer the world right now, and the dominant narrative of the time in the 90s was really driven by a deficit-based narrative. That somehow young people were problems to be solved. That somehow that we had to protect them from risks, and that was the ultimate end. And positive youth development really emerged from a cross-sector view, and frankly, from the belief of those practitioners on the ground that knew that that did not describe the amazing kids they were working with. And this continues today. Now, positive youth development is not just a field of research, it's also an arena of practice. And this is how it was birthed to counter that negative narrative. And so that continues to be our mission today, to partner with you, the heroes, the people on the ground, working with young people every day to conduct applied research and provide support to promote positive youth development so that all young people can have what they need to thrive. And we know we have to do this in more equitable ways. We know that we have to recognize that if we say that all young people need to have what they need to thrive, we have to ask the question, who is not being provided access? This is a part of who we are today and will continue to be who we are of the future. So, what are we talking about when we think about this developmental assets movement, this movement that's spread across countries, across the United States, that has been studied now in lots of peer-reviewed articles, has been published in chapters, and really has become one of the prominent practitioner frameworks for positive youth development. For some of you, you know what developmental assets are. For others, this may be something new to you. And so let's look a little bit deeper about what we're talking about when we talk about developmental assets. That these are the supports, opportunities, and relationships young people need across all aspects of their life. And this was described as 40 developmental assets that were 20 internal, 20 external, that we would include often with multiple items to measure and look at these assets. But one of the things that I appreciated as a practitioner who found developmental assets in the early 2000s as I was working in community-based therapy work and also in the schools was that there's no magic number that necessarily predicts success. That we know, or it's not even the magic number, but it also is which particular assets young people have that enables them to overcome difficulties and challenges and lead to adversity. But instead, we found that the more assets, the better. The less risky behavior, the more positive outcomes that have. And as a practitioner, I could take stock of that map and strengths of young people, both of their internal assets, the things that move them, the things that they add every day, those bright stars that you see and those sparks in their lives, as well as what are the supports that are already in their communities. And this is what we're going to talk about today. That yes, we know that these kind of items load up to these broader categories of internal and external assets, but I want us to dig in deeper into what that means. But we also didn't stop at developmental assets. We know it's important for young people to have these assets in their life, but if they're just a list of things that they have in their life, we have to ask the question, to what end? And in the early 2000s, to complement the work around developmental assets, Search Institute began to explore what are those things that help young people thrive? What does thriving mean for a young person? Not to just merely survive or get by or engage in less risky behavior, but what about those things that are meaningful to them that became this idea of sparks, these passions, these purpose? And how do we create environments where we start to align sparks and internal assets to opportunities and resources? And as we do that, we believe that all young people have the potential to thrive when they have that access to opportunity and resources. So for us, when we think about thriving and we think about developmental assets, we're thinking about it in a broader framework. That yes, there are these internal assets that young people bring to us, and there's this bi-directional influence on the community as the community and the people around them are shaping them. And that's embedded in the ecosystem or the broader system in which has influence on them. But also we've discovered over the last 10 years the power, and not just us, obviously, this has been in decades of research of the power of relationships, that you can almost not overstate the importance from a research perspective of quality relationships for young people. And so the developmental relationships framework came out as a vehicle for change, an actionable framework that is in the day-to-day of the lives of young people that can both help bring out those internal assets and align those sparks, but also be a bridge builder and a connector to opportunity and access of what we talk about as social capital. So as we dive into developmental assets today, we want you to think of it also within the broader understanding of thriving. And we also, as we unpack data, we always have to remember the faces of the young people that we work with, that these are not numbers, they are kids and they are people. And I would just invite you to before we even dive in, to bring a young person to mind. And when we talk about young people, we're talking roughly about that 12, 13 age group up to about 24, 25, that we know this is a wonderful window of opportunity as young people are discovering who they are and what they have to offer this world. So keep this person in mind as we walk through the next steps. Today, we're going to really look more deeply at the developmental assets profile. This was a survey that was created as a shorter survey than our 160 item attitudes and behavior survey. And it was a way to start to get an understanding of what the profiles of assets or the maps of assets were. So as we dive deep into this, Joanna, and we start to talk about developmental assets profile, could you talk a little bit about what it is and also what is the characteristics of the young people we're going to talk about today?
I'd be happy to. I want to start by just saying hello to our audience. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are in the world. We've got national and international representation, I believe, based on responses in the chat. So thanks so much for making time. Again, I'm Joanna Williams. I'm Senior Director of Research, and this slide gives a nice snapshot of the developmental assets profile. It is a 58-item survey, takes young people about 10 minutes to complete. And by looking at the data, we can get a sense of the internal and external assets. There are 4 of each. And we can also reorganize those 58 items to better understand developmental context. So we can understand youth experiences and settings, including, the personal, social, family, community, and school settings. So we can look at both internal and external assets, as well as what development and access to resources and supports and strengths look like across different contexts that we know are important for young people. And if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about the sample we'll be talking about today. So we're fortunate to have a lot of partners who really value understanding the strengths of the young people that they work with and for. And so we have data that include over 27,000 youth from across the country. These are youth who are part of schools and other youth serving organizations, again, from various states across the US. You can see in terms of our data snapshot here, the majority of the sample of young people identified with a binary gender identity, so either female or male. A smaller percentage identified as trans or non-binary or another gender expansive category. We've got representation of a number of different racial and ethnic groups. It's a national sample, although it's not nationally representative. We didn't select intentionally to make sure that we represented all groups, but we do have a pretty good representation of some of the larger and smaller racial ethnic categories that are part of our national population. And as Ben said earlier, we use this to assess developmental assets among young people who are as young as in 4th grade up through 12th grade. So we've got, 2 very similar but slightly different versions of the survey for younger youth in 4th and 5th grade, and then for our middle adolescents as well. So these data were collected between August of 2022 and July of 2023. And I think next we're going to look at some year-to-year comparisons.
Yeah, and I'm blown away, Joanna, as I look at the chat of just people from everywhere. It's pretty phenomenal to have the different partners. Some of them have been longtime partners of ours, and hopefully some are future partners of ours. But it's really exciting to see you all on today. And I'm going to ask you too. I know many of you are still leaving where you're coming from and what organization you're a part of. Also, if you're currently using the DAP or have used our developmental assets survey in any way or the framework, I would encourage you to share that as well. So let's dive in. Let's dive in and look at this data across 2 years. We have data of over 6 million young people that's been collected on developmental assets, which is pretty incredible between our different surveys. And as we look at these numbers right here, Joanna, as we start to look at both the numbers from 21, 22 and 22, 23, I would love for you to kind of unpack this. What do these numbers really mean? And how do we think about these as kind of pulses of what this particular sample of young people are feeling and experiencing?
Sure. So I'm going to start from the top of the slide and work my way down to the details at the bottom. But if we look year over year from a cohort collected in 2021 to 22 to last year's cohort, The total assets overall, that 39.4 and 39.1, are fairly stable. And this is out of 60 possible as being sort of the highest there. So between those 2 years, there wasn't a ton of fluctuation, a slight decrease, but at sort of a tenth of a point level. If we go down to the next level where we have looked at external and internal asset scores, again, they're fairly similar across these two cohorts of young people. So scores in external assets in 2021 were just over 20 and just under 20 in the next cohort, and both around 19 for internal assets. But I want to explain a little bit more about what those scores mean. When young people take the survey and they're responding to each of those items, those 58 items, they're responding on a scale, which you see at the bottom of the slide, that ranges from 0, where they say, I rarely experience this or have access to this, up to 3, where they're telling us, almost all the time I'm experiencing this, or I have this access to this developmental asset. And what we do is we take an average of all of those scores, and then so that we're not dealing in small decimals, we multiply it by 10. So that 19.9 out of 30, if we divided that back by 10, would be about 1.99 on this scale from 0 to 3. So yeah, that puts us on average for both external assets and internal assets. Most youth in our sample on average are saying that they very much or often are experiencing or have access to or connect with whatever the asset item is. So I want to frame that in a way where we're seeing it's an average. It doesn't represent all youth in the sample, but it gives us a little bit of a snapshot of where young people are. And so most youth at some point in their day-to-day experiences are saying that on a pretty regular basis, they're having access to assets. Of course, an average doesn't show all of the variation. And as we talk more about the data, we're going to break down some of these categories so we can see how that looks as we start to kind of unpack and look behind the lens a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to see where if we look at the pulse of this, is that there's it's a space where this group of young people are doing pretty well, but we can do better. We can look and see where are some areas where we can really think about levers and ways to improve. And so let's go deeper into internal assets. And I think it's important as we think about the internal assets or some of the strengths and assets that young people identify as that they have and that are important in their lives, that we really first set the tone, kind of looking at the things that are going right with young people. And so there's lots of items or questions across our kind of 4 broader categories of developmental assets. But I pulled out a few that I thought were really pretty telling of this generation in ways that we must really make sure that we are balancing how we're talking about this generation that right now feels like we're turning back into this deficit-based narrative or even a pathology or crisis narrative. And how do we shape and transform that, and really thinking about more than just that? There's truth to some of those concerns and challenges that young people are facing, but there's also this potential that nearly 90% of young people talk about accepting people that are different from me, that they do that often or very often, that's an important value, or it's important to help others, or developing respect for others. All of these kind of really social competence, but positive values around inclusion are really important for this sample of young people. And then showing restraint, as saying no to tobacco, alcohol, or other drugs, and really are eager to do well in their activities and schools. And so I wanted to highlight that first as framing before we kind of go into more of those broader categories that we see some trends in. And I would love to hear you, Joanna, talk a little bit about these broader internal asset level kind of scores and what it means, and then highlight some of the things that you think are important when we take a look at this slide.
Sure. So here we have broken down into the 4 internal asset categories there that you see: commitment to learning, positive values, social competencies, and positive identity. And again, the year-on-year trends are fairly stable. So if you look at the average scores all the way to the right of each bar, you see that they look pretty similar for young people from a couple of years ago to last year. But we see variation across the assets. So something like social competencies, the average score is 20 out of 30. Again, if we're mapping back onto that 0 to 3 scale, that would be like a 2 out of 3. So many youth are saying that they very much or often are experiencing social competencies. If we look at the bottom row for positive identity, those scores are a little bit lower, and they were lower in 2021. 22 as well. So here we've got an 18 out of 30 in our previous cohort. And I think it's important to, keep that as sort of a starting point of the conversation. But we have a lot of data, and we're able to actually look at, at the item level, what the patterns are that we see among young people. So when we think about positive identity on our survey, we know that young people really need to believe in their own self-worth and to feel they have control over what happens to them. That feeds into how they think about themselves. So identity, particularly during the period of adolescence or about, ages 10 to 25, is like a central process of what young people are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be, asking questions and having experiences to get a sense of who they are and what they value and what's important to them, and, how they think other people see them. So our positive identity includes constructs that reflect things like, sense of agency or personal power, a sense of self-worth, how I'm thinking about the future, how I'm coping with disappointment and other difficulties, and my sense of purpose. And we see that there's a lot of variation as we look at the item level. So some young people are saying, it's a little bit harder for me to deal with disappointment. We put that in the context of, going through, say, COVID, for example. There's a lot of stressors that young people are learning to manage, and maybe more disappointments than there might have been 10 years ago. But young people are also reporting feeling fairly purposeful. So about 72% said they very often or almost always feel like they have a sense of purpose in what they want to do in their life. So we've got some variation as we start to unpack positive identity.
Yeah, I think it's such a powerful point too, as you think about this sense of purpose and thinking about purpose. And I know, Joanna, you've done some work in this area as well, and some of the previous work is coming to Search Institute. Can you talk a little bit about what purpose is and why that's so important for young people today?
Yeah, so I'm glad we have on the slide sense of purpose, because we know from research that sometimes it can be a struggle for any of us, adult or young person, to like really clearly articulate, if somebody says, what is your purpose in life? It can be really
Right,
hard or
right,
stressful to
yeah.
name that. But feeling a sense that you have a purpose, or feeling purposeful, that you're valued and that you're needed and that you have opportunities to contribute, that's what we know really matters, particularly for young people. So it is really an important kind of developmental need that all young people have. They need the kinds of opportunities and experiences and relationships that will help cultivate that sense of purpose. And then as they move through life and different experiences, they can sort of hone in on the things that they feel most purposeful about. But having a sense of purpose is related to feeling, more hopeful about life. It's related to engagement and connection and strong relationships and overall well-being. And again, it's sort of this developmental need. So we should celebrate that 72% of young people are saying that, they very often or almost always feel purpose. And then we should also look at that 6% to say that there's some young people that say, I rarely feel a sense of purpose. And for them, it's not sort of a, characterization of who they are as people, but it gives us a sense of the kinds of opportunities that we may need to create for them so that we can support the cultivation of a sense of purpose for all young people.
Yeah, and I'm also really as a practitioner, as a person working with young people, I think we all can think about like a young person who walks into your office and is has something, a spark. They have that. There's something that you can almost see it in them. This spark, this something they value, something they really care about. It could be anything from, civic engagement to sports to performing arts, but it lights them up. And as I think about the importance of spark, that has the potential to really be aligned with opportunities and resources in a way that starts to feed a sense of purpose. That to me is always exciting, and there's nothing more traumatic in the world to me than a young person who has that spark, who you see it, who never has the opportunity to live that out for lots of different reasons. And there's nothing more powerful to see a young person develop that spark into a sense of purpose that becomes a healthy sense of identity and has access to those opportunities and resources, and they can contribute to the world right now. And I think one of the things I want to really shift to as we think about internal assets and make sure what we're reminded of is that these assets are very much happening in relationship to others and are happening in relation to access to resources and opportunity. As we kind of make that shift to external assets, Joanna, I would love to hear kind of your thinking around how these external assets or access to opportunity and resources interacts with those sparks or those internal assets as well.
Yeah, if we center what we do at Search, which is a positive youth development kind of framework, it really is about centering this kind of mutually beneficial bidirectional interaction between a young person and the settings and resources and relationships that they experience in the communities that they live in. And that is critically important because it reminds us that it really is about, what are those settings that young people have access to? What are the resources? Who are the people? What are the messages they're receiving at sort of broader levels as well, that are critical for supporting, young people? Young people bring a lot to the table, but it doesn't development doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in context. So we need to think critically about, the quality and nature of the resources and relationships that young people have access to if we really believe in all young people's potential for being on thriving pathways.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. And as we think about some of those positives that we're seeing in external assets too, we're seeing that young people are reporting consistently having supportive people across their relational ecosystem, from friends to parents to teachers and other adults, that all of these different people and young people's lives are so critical for their development. And again, these points out some really great areas of strengths and also the potential for growth as we kind of dig into these more broader levels of external assets. These different really important categories, the really are developmental categories that all of us need in our lives, but in particular young people as they're going through their development at this critical period of life. Talk to us a little bit about our data from the external assets profile, Joanna, and what are some things that you see there?
Yeah, so again, similar to when we looked at the internal assets, we look at trends over time. They're fairly stable. So we're seeing young people a couple of years ago reporting pretty similar on average experiences of external assets compared to youth from last year. And then here we actually see, if you remember that 0 to 3 scale, when we look at the averages, for 3 out of these 4 categories, on average, of these over 27,000 young people, they're saying that they, very much are often, or even up to almost always, have experience to elements that represent support and empowerment and boundaries and expectations. So in those 3 categories, many young people are saying that, yes, I have regular access to the kinds of resources and relationships that offer support, empowerment, boundaries, and expectations. The one area where young people a couple of years ago and last year as well reported lower scores on average is in constructive use of time. And I think it's really important for us as Search Institute to sort of share with the audience who's unfamiliar with the DAP a little bit more about what that actually is assessing. So I'd love to talk about that in a little more detail.
Yeah, and I think even as the constructive use of time, as we think about it, it really is I think it's really the access to extracurricular activities or involvement in activities that is important to state that it's not an individual kind of good use of time, because I think if we start to go down that route, it's easy to focus on the individual and not the system. So talk to us a little bit about this constructive use of time, the items and things that you're seeing here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When we talk about constructive use of time, it comes from a place where we know that young people need opportunities that are outside of school to sort of learn and develop new skills and interests and sparks and things like that in relationship with other young people as well as with adults. And so on the developmental assets profile, we ask them about their involvement in a range of activities. So at the top, we see the item that asks about involvement in sort of faith or religious-based groups. And here, many young people, about a third, are saying that they are not at all or are rarely involved in faith-based formalized settings. And I think, again, rather than sort of indicting all young people and saying, oh, they're doing something wrong, I think this is really reflective of just national trends. I think right now among adults, about 3 in 10 adults report regularly participating in some sort of religious activity on a regular, maybe up to a weekly basis. And so I think young people are looking pretty similar to adults here. When we look at the other categories, involvement in sports, creative arts, or spending time with family, we see some variation that points to your note about access. So many young people are saying they're involved in sports almost always or very often, over 60%. And not as many are saying that they're involved in things like music, theater, or art. And that really is an access issue. So again, it's not so much about, youth just deciding that they, don't want to do something constructive, but it pushes us to think about what do young people have access to in their communities? Are there barriers to accessing these kinds of activities and opportunities so that we understand what young people need? The family context is one where we see consistently throughout the survey where most young people are reporting that they very much or often are feeling connected to or supported in their family context. And that's reflected on that last item here as well.
Yeah, that struck me too. And I was looking at this data is when we look across the different contexts of like family, community, school, family really was a strong source of an asset across the empowerment boundaries, all of those areas, and it remains true all the way through adolescence, how important that those roles are in the lives of young people. I think as we think about like this idea that all young people really deserve to have those conditions and opportunities to thrive. One of the items that really stuck out to me that I want to discuss a little bit was this item that's I feel valued and appreciated by others. If we kind of agree at a starting point that all young people deserve to feel seen, valued, and safe as just a fundamental kind of right as a young person, this is one that gets me to think about, yes, on one hand, we have about 59% who are saying that they very often feel valued and appreciated by others, or extremely or almost always for 22%. But if I even look at 10%, which is about 2,700 young people in the sample who say not at all or rarely, that's where we have to start to dig in, because it's not enough to provide quality relationships, access to resources, and opportunity for some kids. And so how do we think about ways to identify who is not getting these kind of experiences within our programs, within research, so that we can target our intervention and our understanding in ways to try to change the stat. So I'd love to transition to that, Joanna, kind of thinking about this idea of how intersecting identities and groups of young people can be looked at from a research standpoint, and what value that might also bring when it comes to programmatic work.
Yeah, so I think we can start looking in a couple of ways at our data at trends that we see. And starting with big picture trends, when you've got over 27,000 youth in a sample, you can really see kind of big picture trends, is sort of the first layer, which then allows us to kind of break the data down further and ask questions about like sort of who, for whom and why and what and under what circumstances do we see some of these patterns. So let's start by looking at developmental patterns that happen over, here we have grade, which is kind of a proxy for age. But when we look at our total internal and external asset scores, we see that there is a decline. So our fourth and fifth graders are reporting higher scores than, say, our eighth, ninth, and 10th graders, where it kind of bottoms out and then starts to trend upwards among older young people in the sample. So this is important. I'm a developmental scientist by training, and I think this is I think of this as a normative trend that we see in a lot of other aspects of youth development, but we can also overlay things like school transitions that happen, for many young people, sixth, seventh, eighth grade. And we can start to then, when we have a sample like we do, to start looking at, young people across different settings and contexts and across different identities. So we have the ability to then break down, does this pattern look the same for youth who are in school settings versus out of school settings? And that might give us some ideas about, where we might need to bolster supports or where we might need to ensure that more young people have access to the assets that are important for supporting their development. So looking at trends, I think, and disaggregating data helps us to start thinking about how might we think about and learn more about these patterns and what they mean.
Yeah, and obviously we won't have time to unpack all those things today as we dig into the data. But another one that we really found when it came to thinking about are the positive identity kind of factors. We saw some differences emerge here too that we thought could be shared as an example. Can you talk a little bit about some of these differences that we found with gender and thinking about young people?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I want to start by acknowledging that on this slide, we have young people who identified with a binary gender identity of male or female. I mentioned earlier, as I was going over the sample, that we had a very small percentage of youth who identified with a non-binary gender identity or another gender expansive category. And whereas for males and females, we had almost 13,000 of them in each group. For youth with gender expansive identities that were not male or female, there were only a few hundred. So it's important not to sort of make comparisons of a few hundred young people to 13,000 young people, but we had enough males and females to compare them to one another. But this is really just the starting point. So two different elements of positive identity look very different. When we ask young people how they feel about themselves, only 58% of girls were saying that they very often or almost always feel good about themselves, compared to 71% of boys. So we can focus on kind of gender-based comparisons and ask questions about, gender categories and, gendered expectations, but we can also go a step further. So we can then start looking just at girls in our sample, do we see variation across, say the kinds of relationships they say they have access to? Do we see variation by region of the country? Is there variation for girls who are in schools versus out of school programs? Are there intersections with other aspects of identity, including racial ethnic identity, age, sort of a developmental perspective, access to community resources, financial and relational? So we can sort of unpack to understand the variation within all of the young people who identify as female, rather than just stopping at a male-female comparison. When we look at another item that's positive identity, I'm thinking about what my purpose is in life. We actually see very similar reports from male and female identifying young people. 73% say they very often or almost always think about their purpose in life. So there's not as much of a difference. So we might not focus on gender-based comparisons, but we could still unpack the data. That's what we would do from a research perspective, working with the data. I just want to make a note that for practitioners using these tools, disaggregating data and looking at patterns is a great opportunity to just then start asking young people questions. So getting in conversations with young people about, how did their experiences map onto the survey trends that you find in your organization? What does it mean to, say, female participants in your program when you ask them how they feel about themselves or other aspects of positive identity? your your data may not look exactly like our national data. But I think then having young people sort of narrate and make meaning of the results gives an opportunity to then think about, are there particular supports or practices that we need to kind of invest in to make sure that we're getting all young people access to the resources and experiences that they need?
Yeah, that's a great idea, and I know it also feeds into that agency and that voice of young people because they often have solutions for solving some of these things, and when we take the time to ask. I am very excited about the future of our work too. I'm excited about the vision you set, Joanna, and the priorities and building off what we've done in the past. Can you give the audience before you go a little picture of what's coming in relation to our research agenda with an example or two?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think, the developmental assets, as you said in the beginning, have been around for a really long time. And I truly believe personally and professionally in the importance of taking a strengths-based view of young people and understanding that they all have capacity and, getting to know what their capacities are and where they may need sort of more resources and supports is a good starting place. I also think that we as researchers need to be really sort of responsive and reflective to youth's current experiences. So we can start with our conversations with our partners and the youth that they work with and for to ask questions about, whether and how the list of assets are really sort of reflective of the things youth are experiencing now in 2024. We've done that with one partner. We have a partner where there was a youth leadership team who wanted to collect some data on assets from other young people in their community. And they decided they actually wanted to make some changes to the assets profile. So they still had 4 internal and 4 external assets, but they swapped out a couple of them. For them, commitment to learning wasn't as important as social responsibility. So they created some items to assess social responsibility. Constructive use of time wasn't as important to them as sense of community. So they included that as an external asset. They also said the outcomes that they were particularly sort of valued and thought were important were friendship and well-being. And they gathered data from participants in their community. And even with changing out those 2 asset categories, they still found the same trend that we often see. When youth were reporting more access to those internal and external assets, they were reporting greater levels of well-being and stronger relational ties, so more friendships as well. So we saw the same pattern, but it was helpful for a community user to say, young people themselves to say, these assets are important. We want a strengths-based view, and also we want to tweak them to make them responsive to our needs. So I think looking forward, that some of that is our kind of responsibility on the research side to make sure that, when we ask about constructive use of time, there's many other things that aren't represented, across those 4 items we shared too, that we could sort of think about, young people participating in communities in different ways. Lots of other ways where there are, cultural experiences that we have to be responsive to as well. So I'm excited about thinking about continuing to sort of revise and update our way of thinking about assets and measuring them to be really reflective of young people's experiences today.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joanna. I love listening to you. I get to work with you every day, and I'm so grateful for your time. Please check out our website for research projects that we're doing, and you can see what's coming down the pipeline. So thank you. I'll let you go ahead and go off camera, Joanna, and I'm going to bring our next guest onto the virtual set here. And I'm very excited to bring Dr. Shaniqua Johnson-Pierce to the table. She is currently serves as the Director of Student Success at the United Way of Delaware. You can read more about her extensive bio. She's originally from Harlem, New York, and lives in Delaware now with her husband and 2 young children. She went to Temple for undergrad and graduate studies in clinical social work and earned her doctorate degree from Wilmington University in education, specifically organizational leadership and innovation. She takes great pride in utilizing the performing arts to support the healing of complex trauma as a mental health therapist and classically trained cellist. Dr. Pierce has spent most of her career embedding evidence-based interventions for scholars attending alternative schools and various outpatients settings. She currently is the director of student success at the United Way of Delaware, where she utilizes her clinical and educational background to lead developmental assets framework initiatives and partnerships with Search Institute to grow assets in each young person's life in Delaware. Welcome, Dr. Pierce. Thank you for being with us today. I would love to just start. I know much about your work and what you're doing, and I'm so excited for you to share with people. But I would love to just start off by asking you what you think of when you think of youth thriving. What comes to your mind as both someone who is a clinician and a understands research and is a researcher? So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for having me. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's off to a great Wednesday. So when I think about young people and their ability to thrive, I think about the mental fortitude that they constantly exhibit because many of the young people that I've worked with in the last 10 to 12 years have all experienced some sort of adversity, childhood adversity, and whether they categorize it as trauma or not. I think we all have a story. And I think being able to see students thrive academically, socially, emotionally, knowing their stories and things that they've had to overcome actually looks like thriving to me when I see the resilience, knowing kind of some of their background story. I think the other elements of thriving that I see with young people is the way that they show up for their peers. I
Mm.
think it's so important. I know you guys talked a little bit earlier about being seen, being valued, being appreciated, feeling appreciated, right? In the work that they do as students, but also as community members. And that is so important. So I think for me, those two elements have been huge here in Delaware and for United Way.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really was struck by in our conversation several weeks ago was really around how you're using the developmental assets framework when you're thinking about cross-sector work, because you work with 4 schools that are promise schools, plus out-of-school time folks as well, and thinking about that cross-sector relationship. Tell us a little bit about how you're using developmental assets with this group and what you're learning.
Yeah, that's such a powerful question because sometimes when you're so busy doing the work, it's kind of nice to take a moment to reflect. So we're really utilizing developmental asset framework on a micro level, but also a macro level. And what I mean by that is there are particularly some of our schools and after school programs we are looking at the DAP from an individual perspective where we have permissions from parents and from staff to facilitate the DAP. So we know what students actually based on their student ID where they're scoring individually. And then on a macro level, we're able to get like this aggregate of the entire school. So because we're able to look into that lens, we're able to provide a more individualized support plan to build assets, which has been really cool because we have received a grant just last year for our Guides Mentor program, where our mentors are going into schools, especially some of our promise schools that are really struggling academically and socially, emotionally, and just you talk about inequity, right? Like there's just not enough resources to allow the school to flourish and our students to flourish. So United Way has pushed into these schools as mentors and utilized the data from the developmental asset framework and the DAP survey to inform students of their assets, right? To highlight their strengths, to inform them some of the lower scoring categories and empower them to set goals that
Mm.
are just coming from them. Maybe they want to set a goal and they hadn't thought about, being a part of the performing arts or joining a sport team, but now they are intrigued because now you ask the question, right? And so I always say the smartest people in the room ask the right questions, right? You don't always have the answers. But I
Sure.
think it's been beautiful to kind of see how students have taking developmental assets and allowed their voice to be heard, and then to also have our staff and support people at United Way to really facilitate that. Is it that they need resources? Is that we need to figure out how we're showing up differently in our relationships in the school setting and maybe at home, right? And getting everyone on board on one accord to really have this collective impact model on the student, right? So it's not just at home, it's not just in the community, it's just not at school, it's all these things. And having a conversation with all of these people in the room has always been the goal for us here at United Way.
Yeah, we talked about that sense of purpose for young people, and it's such a powerful concept. But and you go further and say there's nothing more powerful than a shared purpose. And thinking about, I love how you're using developmental assets, the framework to get shared understanding, get shared purpose, and beginning to identify some areas where you can work together as a collective to have an impact. And the way you center youth voice in creating the change is phenomenal. Talk a little bit about how you've used the focus groups as well. You did the DAP, but you also had these focus groups of young people, and you were asking them, what are some things that we're missing? What are some things? And so maybe talk a little bit about what you're hearing from young people. What are the things they're raising? What are the things, some of the things they're saying? And relation to also what you heard that we're seeing kind of on a more national scale.
Absolutely. So I was really interested, the researcher in me was really interested to get more feedback about what young people felt like they needed more of, and what they would like their support to look like. So when I facilitate the focus group, it really encompassed elementary school students from fourth grade all the way to high school. So 4 through 12, just kind of give you a picture of the young people. And in that focus group, I asked them if they had a magic wand and they woke up tomorrow morning, what types of activities would they be involved in if money wasn't an issue, right? To take part in, to build their own assets. And many of the students highlighted things that were actually in the survey, which is performing arts, right? The ability to be a part of learning to play an instrument or part of a choir or part of the theater, but not necessarily having the funds to do that, right? And they were honest about, knowing about their socioeconomic standard, in their families, right? And so the other part of that, students really want to take part in sports, but they also felt like some of the sports seasons were very short-lived. So it depends on when the students took the survey, whether or not they answered that question, to the best of their ability based on the season. So that was something we looked into, trying to figure out what could that look like year round to keep young people engaged and to make sure that they had the resources. So one of the things that we actually did is we partnered with another nonprofit, right? Because you can't just do this work alone. It's called the Green Beret Project, who actually funds some of the students' after school programming, but also some of the extracurricular activities, so that making sure that, finances isn't an issue for our young people. Now, we haven't been able to do that, unfortunately, for all of our students, but even just the beginning of the conversation and maybe possible grant writing, maybe we can make that happen for young people.
Yeah.
And the other question that I asked them from the focus group was, what kind of support do you feel like you need, right? So we talked about the experiences, but what kind of support you feel like you need? And the two things that they identified, which was one, just a trusted adult that's not their parent. Not that they don't love their families, because that was a huge win for us in the context area, but someone that's not a parent that they could trust and go to. And then secondly, they said a mental health professional, a therapist, just someone to process with, who actually can teach them skills around self-regulation and dealing with difficult emotions related to grief and trauma, which was really profound. I wasn't expecting to learn that from my young people that I work with, but I was excited to as a clinician, because I think there's also the stigma in our community that people and young people aren't asking for help. And I felt like they would if they felt like it was easier to, and it just was the norm to have access to these things on a continuum.
Yeah, no, I just was thinking about how it can be hard to ask for help if you don't feel like people are listening. And, that's an interesting, like the fact that you start really listening and you're really centering the voice is just, it's just such a powerful way that you've used developmental assets framework and brought your expertise and who you are in the communities as a collective. It's inspirational to see that kind of work. I know the other area you talked about was really around some of the same trends with positive identity, and I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that and how that's directed some of the school-based efforts or efforts being done in your community.
Absolutely. So one of the trends in asset categories that we saw, similar to the national average that you guys exhibited at the Search Institute, was the personal identity. That was the lowest asset category across all of our 8 schools and programs that we surveyed. And so what we did is we had a meeting and we talked about our concerns, our first emotional response to it, right? Just, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Sometimes we don't always know if we're not asking the right questions. So I was glad to learn that the DAP really highlighted some things that we had no idea about, which is how young people feel about themselves and how they see themselves in the world. And so this is where I was able to touch, tap into my own assets and say, okay, well, what can I offer that is free, right? One, immediately to start hopefully changing the needle in this asset category. So one of the things I did was we facilitated a poetry exercise, a couple sessions, and we created I am poems, right? Which is really, really cool exercise where you go on this notion of I am great. You start with the positive affirmations. I am from, I am able, I am capable, I dream, right? And so the students kind of use these different prompts to create a poem. And many of the students did a great job. And then from those poems, we really process how we feel about ourselves, some of our strengths and talents, things that we want to work on or feel like, we could use support on to make us feel better about how we are seen. But race became a thing too. Race was ironically mentioned in a lot of the poems. And I think, our students are very aware of how race plays a role in our society. And I think it's really interesting because of course, race is always an element, but I think I wasn't expecting young people to be as honest and transparent about these social issues. And I think they are more conscious in this generation, I think we ever were in mine.
Yeah, no, it's so good. And I think that self-narrative piece of constructing some of their self-narrative, because often young people are internalizing narratives about themselves from the messages they're hearing around them. And I could imagine at that intersection of race in particular, how messaging can be sometimes the ways that people are putting messages in the world and talking about things can have that consequence of young people internalizing that and giving them a place of putting them in that rightful presence place to say, like, no, you can define part of who you are too, and bring that. And this is a strength of your positive identity, is your heritage, your culture, your history. And I think that's a really just a beautiful. I would love to hear more about that, because I bet it was really inspiring to hear and listen to.
Was great. And I just wanted to add, just really quickly, when you talk about the celebration of culture, there are two things that we do every year at United Way that I've been a part of on the committee, which I'm super proud of, is we plan a Black Student Summit and a Latinos Unidos Student Summit, where we have students from across the state in Delaware help us actually facilitate and plan these summits. And they include everything you can think of, from mental health workshops to financial literacy to celebrating the dancing and the food of these cultures. And so I have been really excited to see these assets grow in a whole different capacity that I hadn't aligned with developmental assets, but yet I can see how these students are just so talented and just bring so much to the table, and creating these opportunities outside of school to be a part of something that is really fun and exciting, but still contributes to their learning has been really cool to see.
Dr. Pierce, our time went by very quick, and I forgot that there was even people watching, because and that happens when I talk to you. I just love to talk to you. And I'm so grateful for your partnership. I know there's great work ahead. You make us better. You bring so much from the experience, and I know that the audience benefited from you today. So thank you so much for your time. And it's too bad we couldn't have a round of applause, but we will continue to keep talking as well. So I'm going to let you go ahead and go off of camera as well, and kind of close up to be on time. Um, uh, what a wonderful kind of balance of getting a deep dive into our research and our work, and just gives you a little taste, and then hearing the practice side of it, that's really utilizing data and making data informed decisions, but not as the end all be all, that elevating the voice of young people and bringing them to the table around solutions, and engaging in a conversation, so that data doesn't just stay data, but we think about that data journey that moves from to dialogue and conversation, then to action. And this is where we sit as an organization, is really in this space between research and practice. We love what we do. We're grateful for all the practitioners. We want to support you in what you're doing. I would invite you to dig in deeper. We have lots of different ways to stay connected to us, from subscribing to our newsletter, to visiting our solutions page and our resource hub. We have, if you want to go deeper and you don't have a background in developmental assets and you want to understand at a deeper level, we have some workshops that are coming up around developmental assets and being able to go deeper with it and take it with you to build assets in your community. If positive identity is something that you really are seeing with the youth you're serving, I would say even our Spark workshops gives you an opportunity to dive deep into the Sparks work. And then finally, the vehicle of change and development of relationships, we're continuing to see that work grow and be powerful. And that framework is so important to who we are too. So please, but most of all, and more importantly, please let us know if we can help you in any way. If you need help navigating, reach out to us, and we will have people who will be available to talk about your needs at this moment in time. Now, I want to close with inviting you to think back to that young person in your life. Think about one thing that you learned today, one of those developmental asset areas or an item that you would like to work on with that person, and start to think about what actions, what behaviors can you do to help build that positive identity or create that opportunity and access to an extracurricular activity or whatever it is. We are grateful for you. There is no way that we can be all things to all kids individually, but as a community, we can. So thank you so much. Everybody who registered will be receiving an email with the recording of this webinar. We also will give a full report that people can kind of dive into the data. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for spending time with us today.